We're looking at the stock market for the week of November 18th. This is James with Net News Ledger. Let's dive in right now.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive into the market. You know, things are getting kind of wild out there. This week, November 11th to the 17th. Oh boy. Some ups, some downs, and a whole bunch of twists and turns. I'm feeling like I just stepped off a roller coaster.
Yeah, it's definitely been a week of mixed signals for sure. I mean, you've got some sectors surging ahead while others are lagging behind. And then you got Bitcoin. Bitcoin's hitting a new all-time high while traditional markets are a bit shaky. It's like, what is going on?
Right. It makes you wonder, like, is this Bitcoin rally a sign of something bigger? You know, like a shift in how investors are thinking? Or is it just a temporary thing, a blip?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think what's really interesting here is that this whole feeling of uncertainty, it's everywhere you look. From how the U.S. market is doing to, you know, what's happening with geopolitics and oil prices. Feels like everyone's just kind of holding their breath, waiting to see what's going to happen next.
Yeah, it's like the calm before the storm or something. So let's break it down a bit. Let's start with what actually went down in the U.S. market this past week. We saw the S&P 500 dip just a little. The NASDAQ 100 kind of followed suit. And the Dow Jones, you know, it pretty much stayed flat. Not exactly a super confident picture, right?
No, not really. And what makes it even more confusing is we're seeing these data points that just don't seem to make sense together. Like, take the Consumer Price Index or CPI. It measures inflation rate. Well, it basically matched what most people were expecting. Headline inflation went up 0.2%, and core inflation, which is the one that doesn't include those super junky food and energy prices, that one rose by 0.3%.
Okay, so inflation is still something to watch, but it's not like totally out of control. But then we got that jobless claims report, and wow, huge drop down to 217,000, the lowest it's been since May. Usually that's a sign that things are good in the job market.
Yeah, you'd think so. It's like the economy's sending us these mixed messages.
Totally. It's no wonder the market's all hesitant.
Exactly. And then on top of all that, we've got treasury yields dropping. The 10-year yield, which is kind of the standard for interest rates, went down to 4.42%. What that's telling us is that a lot of investors are thinking the Fed might cut rates in December.
So even though the job market seems to be doing okay, investors are betting on a rate cut.
It's almost like they think the Fed might have gone too far with those rate hikes. Like maybe they're worried about pushing the economy into a recession.
Okay, that makes sense. So looking ahead to next week, the week of November 18, 22, 2024, what should we brace ourselves for with all this uncertainty hanging around?
Oh, I think we can definitely expect more of this volatility. We got a super busy week coming up, key economic data releases, you know, those are always fun, plus a bunch of corporate earnings reports. And of course, you can't forget all the happenings in tech and crypto. I have a feeling it's going to be a wild ride for the markets.
Speaking of wild rides, are there any particular areas that look like they're going to be hit harder than others? Or are there any bright spots we should be paying attention to? You know, just trying to get a sense of where to focus in this whole mess.
Well, the good news is both the New York Stock Exchange and the Toronto Stock Exchange have been holding up pretty well, all things considered, but inflation and interest rate worries, those could definitely throw a wrench in things.
So it sounds like those major exchanges, they're weathering the storm for now, but the seas could get rough again. Are there any specific sectors or companies that you're keeping an eye on that are looking particularly good?
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely some areas that are worth watching.
Okay, so where should we start?
Well, I think the energy and financial sectors, those are looking pretty promising right now.
Oh, really? Why is that?
There's some talk about potentially loosening regulations in those sectors, which could mean more profits, and that always attracts investors. Plus, we're seeing more mergers and acquisitions happening, or M&A, you know, and that usually means people are feeling pretty confident about growth potential.
So if someone's looking for opportunities, where should they be looking?
I'd say keep an eye on the big players in energy like ExxonMobil. And in finance, you can't go wrong with looking at the big banks like JP Morgan Chase.
That's interesting. So some sectors are struggling with all this uncertainty, while others seem to be almost thriving on it.
It's true.
What about the flip side? Are there any sectors that investors should be extra careful with right now?
Well, one that comes to mind is healthcare. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s recent nomination to head up Health and Human Services. You know, his views on vaccines and other health topics have caused quite a bit of controversy.
Yeah, I can see how that would make investors nervous.
Exactly. It's hard to know what direction the industry is headed in.
So are there any particular companies that are looking especially vulnerable in healthcare right now?
I think the big pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, they might be in a tough spot.
Why is that?
Well, they're so big and they rely so heavily on government policies that any big changes could really impact them.
Okay, so energy and finance are looking pretty good. Healthcare, on the other hand, not so much. What about tech? It feels like tech is always either soaring or crashing. Where do things stand right now?
Oh, tech is always one to watch for sure. This week is going to be particularly interesting because Nvidia and Snowflake, they're both releasing their earnings reports.
Those are some big names in tech.
Oh yeah, for sure. And how they perform could really set the tone for the entire sector.
It's like they're the bellwether for the whole tech world.
Exactly.
So what kind of impact are we talking about here?
Well, if they blow everyone's expectations out of the water, it could boost confidence in the whole tech sector, and that could even lift the market overall.
Okay, so positive results, good news for everyone. What if things don't go so well?
Well, then we could see a sell-off. Not just in tech stocks, but potentially across the board.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah, kinda.
So a lot riding on those two reports. And speaking of things with a lot riding on them, let's not forget about crypto. Always a wild card. What's the latest in that corner of the market?
Well, Bitcoin is still hanging around that $60,000 mark. But with all the volatility we've been seeing, who knows what'll happen next week. Remember earlier when we were talking about how it hit a new all-time high while everything else seems so uncertain? It's kind of a microcosm of the whole situation right now.
Right. It's like Bitcoin is dancing to its own tune, completely ignoring all the drama in the traditional market. It makes you wonder, is this a sign that it's becoming more of a mature and independent asset? Or is it just a temporary disconnect?
It's a tough one to call, but it's definitely something.
All right, so with your thumb,
You got energy and finance.
find the control
healthcare
stick
looking really
on your controller.
shaky, tech hanging in the balance, and
Right
crypto
there.
doing its own thing. It's a lot to keep track of. Are there any other sectors or trends our listeners should have on their radar as they try to figure out this market?
You know, one sector that's worth paying attention to is mining, specifically the companies that are producing gold and copper.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, the demand for those metals is still really high, especially with all the infrastructure projects going on and the shift towards renewable energy.
So what kind of companies are we talking about?
Companies like Barrick Gold, one of the biggest gold producers out there, and BHP Group, they're a big player in copper. They could see some real benefits from this continued demand.
Okay, that makes sense. But it sounds like there are still some risks involved, even with this potential for growth.
Oh yeah, for sure. The mining sector has its own set of challenges to deal with. Inflation, rising costs, supply chain problems. It's a tough business.
So even when there are opportunities, there are always risks to consider. It's like navigating this market is a constant balancing act.
Exactly.
You got to weigh the potential rewards against all the uncertainty.
It's all about managing risk and staying informed.
Well said. Before we move on, though, I think we need to zoom in on some of the specific events and data that are likely to have a big impact on the market next week. You know, the things our listeners should really be watching closely as they make their investment decisions.
Absolutely. First up, we've got corporate earnings reports. Those are always a good way to get a peek into how companies are actually performing. They can give you some hints about what's happening in different industries as a whole.
It's like getting a behind-the-scenes look at how the sausage is made. Okay, so earnings reports are important. What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, beyond the earnings reports, we've got a whole bunch of economic data releases coming out. I'd say keep a particularly close eye on the inflation and employment figures. We already touched on the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, but we'll also be getting updates on things like producer prices, which measure inflation at the wholesale level, and consumer spending, which is a huge driver of economic growth.
Okay, so it's important to look at multiple indicators to get a more complete picture of how the economy is doing. Got it. What about employment? What are the key things to be watching there?
The unemployment rate, that's always a big one. But we'll also get data on average hourly earnings and the labor force participation rate. Those numbers can tell us a lot about the health of the job market and whether wages are starting to rise, which can impact inflation, you know?
So it sounds like we're going to have a lot of data to digest and analyze next week. Are there any other events or announcements that could potentially shake things up in the market?
Oh, for sure. Keep an eye out for any announcements from the Federal Reserve about interest rates or monetary policy. Those can have a huge impact on the markets.
Yeah, the Fed's decisions about interest rates can affect everything. Borrowing costs, consumer spending, business investment, you name it.
Exactly. They're like the conductor of the economic orchestra.
And with all the uncertainty we've been talking about, their decisions are more important than ever.
Absolutely. Every word they say will be scrutinized for clues about the future. And any surprises could send shockwaves through the markets.
So we've got corporate earnings, economic data, and the Fed all on the agenda for next week. But with all this talk of uncertainty, it's easy to forget that there are still some bright spots out there, like Bitcoin, for example. It's been hovering around $60,000. But earlier this week, it went crazy and blasted past $90,000. What's driving that incredible surge, and what does it tell us about how investors are feeling?
It's a fascinating thing, isn't it? While traditional markets are all tangled up in uncertainty, Bitcoin seems to be thriving on it.
So are investors seeing Bitcoin as a safe haven?
That's a good question. It is a bit of a paradox. Bitcoin is both volatile and potentially a safe haven at the same time. It's a high-risk, high-reward asset, and that attracts investors with all sorts of different motivations.
So some people see it as a hedge against inflation, others as a bet on the future of finance, and some are just in it for the thrill of the ride.
Exactly.
But this recent surge does seem to suggest that at least some investors are starting to see Bitcoin as a legitimate alternative to traditional assets.
I think that's a fair assessment.
And that leads us to the big question. Are we witnessing a fundamental shift in investor confidence towards decentralized assets, or is this just a temporary phenomenon?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, I don't think anyone has a definitive answer yet. It's definitely possible that we're at a tipping point where cryptocurrencies are moving from the fringes to the mainstream. But it's also possible that this is just a blip on the radar, a speculative bubble that will eventually burst.
Like we're standing at a crossroads, and we don't know which path will lead to the future of finance. But one thing's for sure, it's an exciting time to be watching all of this unfold.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners out there who are trying to make sense of it all, what are the key things to keep in mind?
I would say the most important thing is to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Good advice.
Don't be afraid to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and explore different perspectives. The financial world is constantly changing, and the more you learn, the better prepared you'll be to navigate it.
Excellent point. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this deep dive.
Sounds good.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's always more to learn. To our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of the market. We'll be back next week with more insights and analysis. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and happy investing.
See you next time. And you know, it's like we're trying to read tea leaves in a hurricane.
Yeah, sometimes it feels that way.
Yeah.
But even without having all the answers, I think we can still make some educated guesses about the bigger picture. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways? What are the things our listeners should really remember as they're trying to navigate this crazy market?
Well, I think the one thing that's been really clear throughout our conversation is just how much uncertainty there is right now. We're seeing these mixed signals literally every way we look. From the economic data to corporate earnings to what's happening around the world geopolitically.
It's true. But amidst all this uncertainty, are there any guiding principles or strategies that investors can rely on? How can we make smart decisions without feeling like we're just gambling?
I think the key is to stay informed. Do your research and just be prepared for anything. Don't let fear hold you back, whether it's the fear of missing out or the fear of making a mistake.
Makes sense. Knowledge is power, as they say. But how do you avoid getting totally overwhelmed by all the information out there? It's like trying to drink from a fire hose sometimes.
That's such a good point. I think that's where it becomes really important to focus on finding good quality information and to develop a critical eye, you know? Don't just blindly follow the headlines or chase the latest fads. Look beyond the hype and focus on the fundamentals.
So it's not just about staying informed. It's about staying informed with the right information. Once we have that information, how do we actually use it to make good investment decisions?
You know, I think about it like building a house. You need a strong foundation, a solid framework, and a flexible design that can adapt to changing conditions.
I like that.
So in investing, your foundation is made up of your financial goals, your risk tolerance, and your time horizon. Your framework is your investment strategy, and your design is your ability to adjust your portfolio based on new information and market developments.
That's a great analogy. It's not about trying to predict the future. It's about building a portfolio that can handle the ups and downs. So with all the uncertainty we've been talking about, how do we actually find the confidence to make good decisions? It's easy to get caught up in all the fear and anxiety.
You're right. I think it's important to remember that investing is a long game. Don't get too focused on the day-to-day movements of the market. Focus on your long-term goals. Stick to your strategy and try not to let emotions cloud your judgment.
Slow and steady wins the race, right?
Exactly.
Consistency and discipline, those are key, especially when things are volatile. Well, let's zoom out for a second and think about the bigger picture. We've talked a lot about Bitcoin hitting record highs while traditional markets are struggling. Does this mean that investors are losing confidence in the traditional system? Are we seeing a shift?
All right, so with your thumb, can you find the control stick on your
Honestly, I
controller?
don't think anyone has a definitive answer yet. It's certainly possible that we're
there.
at a turning point.
So if you push that forward, you can see a light come out of your hand.
But it's also possible this is just
It was weird. Now push it and hold it.
a bubble that will eventually burst.
It's like we're at a crossroads, and we don't know which path leads to the future of finance.
I know it's both exciting and a little nerve-wracking.
All right, you gotta do two things
But
before you
it's
can drive
definitely
it.
fascinating to watch it unfold. So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of it all, what are the most important things for them?
I'd say stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Don't be afraid to ask questions, challenge what you think you know, and explore different viewpoints. The financial world is constantly changing, so the more you learn, the better prepared you are.
Well, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's always more to explore. To our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of the market. We'll be back next week with more insights and analysis. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and happy investing.
Yeah, it really is amazing to see how things.
It is.
We've talked about so much in this deep dive. Bitcoin's crazy ride, that potential rate cut in December, the K-shaped recovery thing, and the tensions in the Middle East. It's a lot to process.
It really highlights how complex the market is, right? Sometimes it feels like we're trying to figure out a puzzle, but we're missing half the pieces. I know what you mean. But even without all the pieces, we can still make some educated guesses about what the big picture might look like. So as we wrap things up here, what are the key takeaways? What are the big things our listeners should remember as they try to make sense of all this?
I think if there's one big theme that's come up over and over, it's uncertainty. Everywhere we look, there are these mixed signals.
That's true.
The economic data, corporate earnings, of the global situation. It's like trying to predict the weather, but you only have a broken barometer.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So amidst all this uncertainty, are there any guiding principles or strategies that investors can rely on?
You know, I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Do your homework, be prepared for anything. Don't let fear, whether it's FOMO or the fear of making a bad call, paralyze you.
I think that's really important.
Yeah.
But how do you avoid getting completely overwhelmed by all the information out there? There's so much to keep track of.
Right. And that's where it becomes crucial to focus on finding quality sources and to really develop that critical thinking muscle, you know? Don't just take headlines at face value or chase the latest trends.
No, it's about being discerning with the information you consume.
Exactly.
So once we have that good information, how do we actually use it to make smart investment decisions?
I like to think of it like building a house. You need a solid foundation, a good framework, and a design that can adapt to changes.
I like that.
In investing, your foundation is your financial goals, your risk tolerance, and how long you plan to invest. Your framework is your investment strategy, and your design is your ability to adjust based on new information.
That's a great analogy. It's not about trying to predict the future. It's about being prepared for whatever comes your way.
Exactly.
But with all this uncertainty swirling around, how do you find the confidence to make those decisions?
I think it helps to remember that investing is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't get too caught up in the day-to-day ups and downs. Focus on your long-term goals, stick to your plan, and don't let emotions drive your decisions.
Slow and steady wins the race, right?
Exactly.
But let's zoom out for a moment and think about the big picture. We've talked a lot about Bitcoin hitting record highs while traditional markets are struggling. Does this mean investors are losing faith in the old system? Are we seeing a major shift towards decentralized assets?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And honestly, I don't think anyone has a definitive answer yet. It could be that we're at a tipping point where cryptocurrencies are becoming mainstream. But it's also possible that this is just a temporary thing, a speculative bubble that will eventually burst.
So we're at a crossroads, and we don't know which path leads to the future of finance.
I know, it's exciting and a little scary at the same time.
It really is. But it's fascinating to watch it all play out. So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this, what are the key things to keep in mind?
I'd say stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Don't be afraid to ask questions, challenge what you think you know, and explore different perspectives.
Those are great points.
The financial world is always evolving, so the more you learn, the better equipped you'll be.
That's great advice. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's always more to learn. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be back next week with more insights and analysis. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and happy investing.
That's our market overview for the week of November 19th to 22nd. Keep in touch. If you like what we're doing, subscribe. This is James with Net News Ledger, live from Thunder Bay, Ontario.